listeners, and welcome to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. I'm your host for this episode, Justin Remer. Today, it's another SKYLIT author conversation, and today we have Matthew Blackwell, the author of the book on plunderphonics in the Genre 33 1/3 series. Thank you for being with us, Matthew.
Hey, Justin. Thanks for having me.
And you're talking to me all the way from Spain, that's correct?
Yes, yeah, I live in the Canary Islands, which are sort of, it's actually off the coast of Morocco, but
oh, wow.
Yeah, it's part of Spain.
So I finished reading the book a couple days ago, and I always am blowing smoke up authors' behinds because I tend to only interview people whose books I enjoy, but this might be one of my favorite pop culture books of the year.
Oh, wow. That's really great to hear. Thanks.
I mean, it helps that this is a lot of stuff that I'm interested in, like sample-based music, and also just sort of like the legality of like sample music. Obviously, since I read your book, I know exactly what it's about, but maybe for our listeners, if you could explain a little bit about what plunderphonics is and how you came to the project.
Yeah, so plunderphonics, actually, I have to open the book like this by explaining that if you go to rate your music or Bandcamp or something, and you look at plunderphonics, it's not actually quite plunderphonics. People these days have taken it to mean any sort of sample-based music. But really, plunderphonics originally was people purposefully deploying unlicensed samples in order to make a point about copyright. And so it started in 1985 when John Oswald coined the term plunderphonics in an essay, and it always had this sort of political bent about expanding fair use and sort of confronting the copyright licensing system. Now, if you go to rate your music, it says Ground Zero and all of these weird experimental records are plunderphonics, but not really. And so at first I have to explain what it actually is. So it's a lot about copyright, and I first got interested in it with Girl Talk because I was, I think, a freshman in college when Night Ripper dropped, and that was the perfect age for, first of all, it was in every bar, every nightclub, every house party was playing Night Ripper. But also, it was the exact right age for me to get interested in copyright law and all of this sort of more intellectual stuff, right? Because I was taking these classes on, the law and history, and I was like, wait a second, how is he getting away with this?
Yeah.
And I think everybody was wondering how he was getting away with it. And I discussed that in the book, too, as there's, people have different explanations for how he got away with it. But that got me interested in copyright. And I sort of always wanted to write a 33 1/3 book, but I didn't think any of these albums by itself would make a book,
Yeah.
John Oswald's Plunderphonic is a great album, and it's a very weird album and an interesting album, but I don't know if it's the type of album that 33 1/3 is looking for. So then when they announced the genre series, I was like, okay, I can start there, and then I can go into the Avalanches and Negative Land and Girl Talk and all these others.
Yeah. Because there is a 33 1/3 on the Gray album, the Danger Mouse, that combines the Black Album and the White Album. And I think that same writer then did in the Australia spin-off series, the one on the Avalanches. So he's got that. He's got those albums on lock, I think.
Yeah, I figured there would be of those, and I had to kind of give space to some albums like J Dilla's Donuts I mentioned.
Yeah,
but there's a full book on that in the series too.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So there are sometimes where I skirt those albums that I know have been covered in more depth elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, because it is interesting, and I think I also similarly just had a thought of plunderphonics, because I think Spotify even has this is plunderphonics, like one of those things.
Do they really?
I think so, but
that would be very interesting because Spotify also really hunts down illegal samples. So it would be interesting to see what Spotify calls plunderphonics.
Right, but that's what I'm saying is I think what they have there is mostly just sort of like the canon of like sample based music, like the Avalanches and stuff like that.
Right, all the legal ones. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because it's interesting too. Because I also noticed that I forget what platform it was, but that your book is also sort of like it's under music, but it's also under law. Because it does discuss so much about the precedents of like the public of like how Plunderphonics has expanded our legal understanding of fair use and the public domain, and also I just love the I forget what ruling it was, but the ones where it's like, okay, we've established that this is all good, and then like one judge is like, nope. I find in favor of the guy who thinks that this 2-second snare hit deserves royalties. So there's some drama there.
Oh yeah, there's a couple of those. The most famous one is 1991 when Gilbert O'Sullivan sues Biz Markie, the rapper.
Yeah.
For his album I Need a Haircut, had a song on it called Alone Again, which samples quite heavily from O'Sullivan's song Alone Again Naturally. And the judge, unfortunately for that case, was Judge Kevin Duffy, who his decision there was one of the worst. I think in the book I call it one of the worst copyright decisions ever made or something like that. And it's not just my opinion. A lot of people say that it's horrible because he starts out with quoting the Bible. And he says, "Thou shalt not steal." And then he says, you're stealing, that's it. So he doesn't go into the copyright law. He doesn't quote the Copyright Act. He doesn't do any of the discuss the 4 aspects of fair use or go into any sort of discussion of how this might affect the market for O'Sullivan's work. He just says, yeah, you stole it. And so the ruling said Marquis owed $250,000 and Warner Brothers had to take that album off the shelves. And so that was the big one that really made record labels look up and go, oh, now we have to deal with this on, a very serious way. I think the one that you're talking about is a bit later, and it went even further in saying that even a snare hit, the tiniest thing, needs to be licensed. And that was when Bridgeport Music sued Dimension Films it's a complicated story, but there's 2 seconds of a Funkadelic track that was sampled in a NWA track that was then put on a soundtrack. And all of this stuff was sort of hoovered up. All these copyrights were bought up by Bridgeport Music, which is called a sample troll because they just buy copyrights in order to win money in these lawsuits.
Yeah, because you point out, like, George Clinton himself isn't making any money on this deal. It's just the guy who bought up the copyright to his track. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And George Clinton still says that he was tricked, that those contracts are fake. And I don't know how true that is. But George Clinton is not getting any of this money. It's this company that bought all of these copyrights for... And then they go on to sue other people and win more money.
So, I mean, that aspect is fascinating, but also the just musically, the history that you get into, because you start sort of like our understanding of it. And I had heard the name Charles Ives, but it literally, like, I had no understanding of who he was and what he did. And now that you've laid it out, I find it kind of fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about Charles Ives?
Yeah, Charles Ives was a fascinating figure. His music is still pretty experimental today, still not to everybody's taste, probably. But he was a sort of classical or modern classical composer. But in his works, he would take quotations from Beethoven, from old folk songs, from just the whole history of music, and include them in his works. to the point that his peers said it's really a shame that he won't come up with his own stuff. They're saying he's a great composer, but he will not stop taking from other people. But for him, it was a way of recognizing that music is a continuum. It's not a single genius who comes up with all of this stuff out of the blue. And so he was really insistent that, everybody should quote from other people. And he was already an early copyright advocate. This was in the 19-teens, 1920. And a magazine that he gave a piece to publish copyrighted that work so that they could publish it. And he got very mad and he said, this is for everybody. I don't want copyrights on any of my work. People should be able to copy it and perform it and quote from it as much as they want to. So this is in the 19-teens. And, normally you wouldn't think that far back about this type of music. But yeah, I start there because it's the sort of earliest instance that I can think of where a composer stands up and goes, I absolutely do not want my work to be copyrighted. This is free. It should be shared. And he was kind of a pioneer in that way.
Yeah. You also talk about John Cage. And it's interesting because I just talked to Dusty Henry about his genre book on 20th century ambient. And it's John Cage is also sort of in the early stages there. It's very interesting, like which figures sort of like figure into the formation of all these different musical ideas. But yeah, John Cage. I forget. Do you mention Steve Reich's like tape things that he did? Or
I think I mentioned it very, very briefly, just as an example of of tape-based experimental music. But for those, so Come Out and It's Gonna Rain were from Steve Reich in the 60s. But he was not stealing other people's music. Those were recordings that he had permission to use or that he made himself.
Right.
But yeah, these people tend to just show up, especially John Cage. I wouldn't be surprised if he showed up in most 33 and the Third books just because he's so influential in so many different ways. Yeah.
He comes up because one of the pieces that he did involved was it record players or was it radios or was it both?
Oh, well, he used everything. So there's one with radios. There's one with several with record players. These are all in the Imaginary Landscape series. And what's interesting is the last Imaginary Landscape number 5, I think it would have been the first plunderphonic composition, but we don't have it. What he did is he took a bunch of jazz albums, vinyl records, recorded them onto tape. He cut the tape up, put it back together in almost a random order. So he was rearranging other recordings. Not a note of it was his own, but he was the person who put it together in that order, right? But we don't have that. It was lost. So other people have done that composition using different types of records. But that's sort of maybe the earliest plunderphonic composition, but not the recording, because nobody knows what happened to that one.
Right. I guess I'm curious, what was your first exposure to this? Well, you said Girl Talk, but I mean, like more of the sort of, I guess you would say maybe academic or theoretical versions of these kind of sample-based music. Was it John Oswald?
I think I worked my way backwards to John Oswald, probably, because John Oswald's music now, I think, is great, but it's a little more experimental than Girl Talk, let's say that.
Yeah.
You don't go to a club and dance to John Oswald.
Yeah.
So I think I worked my way sort of backwards, Danger Mouse was huge. That was a couple years before.
Sure.
And then Negative Land, of course, is more rock-oriented, I would say, but a little more accessible than John Oswald. So I would sort of work my way back. I don't remember the first time that I heard John Oswald, but I would guess that I started where I was in 2006 and then kind of went through, on allmusic.com, working my way backwards through all these artists.
I think my friend was I forget the name of the label, but like some label had put out like a 2 DVD set of all these videos that Negative Land had made. And so seeing that, I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's like, oh, if you think that's interesting, you should check out, Plunderphonic by John Oswald.
Yeah, that's exactly how it happens. It gets a little more extreme if you think this is interesting.
Right. Yeah. What is it? That Negative Land track, Christianity is Stupid. Then I wound up seeing that like evangelical film that the lyric is sampled from the literal line, Christianity is stupid. So yeah, you end up going down all sorts of rabbit holes with them. But Negative Land, their best known piece you talk quite a bit about, and it's very interesting, is the single that they just called U2, with U2 huge on the cover.
Yeah.
And they pretended like that wouldn't be confusing to people, but obviously.
Yeah, I think that they kept up the ruse that they were doing it sort of honestly, but obviously they're not. It came out right before Octoon Baby in the early 90s, 91, I think. And obviously it says U2 in giant letters, and then in little tiny type down at the very bottom it says Negative Land. And so in 91, you can't run to the internet to see what this thing is. So you go, oh, this is the new single by U2. And then you put it on, and Casey Kasem, America's top 40 DJ, the star of countless children's cartoons and all this stuff, just starts cursing. just vitriol, right? And so clearly at that point you should realize that this is not U2, right? And it's a parody record. And then immediately within like a week or 10 days or so, they get sued by Island Records. And that's like a 5-year odyssey.
Yeah.
Because they have to deal with Island Records, they have to deal with the publishers, they have to deal with Casey Kasem. And then at a certain point, their label turns on them and says, wait a second, you should give us all this money. We're getting sued, but it should be, your money because it's your fault. And so then they end up in kind of a B plot with SST and Greg Ginn. So yeah, I think most of my chapters are kind of divided between the main artist and a few other things that were happening simultaneously. But that example was so complicated and so much stuff was happening that the whole chapter is just Negative Land, because there's layers and layers, and they just kept persevering through it. I really respect them for just not giving up through that whole. It started in 1991 and it just kept going until 94 or 5 before it was all settled.
Yeah, as you say, like, they put it out through the punk rock label SST, who clearly are like cool with this prankster to a level until it's like, oh, this is going to cost us a lot of money. And then, and then they're like, you guys, you tricked us or whatever. It's like, I don't know if they did, my friend. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. There's letters that the band writes back to the label saying like, you put this out, you knew what was on it.
Right.
So their idea was, let's just split it 50-50. We'll pay part, you pay part. And then nobody was happy with that, and it blew up even more. But yeah, SST, there's a great book about SST, and I wish I could remember the author's name, but it's the whole history of SST. And everybody was on SST. But then Greg Ginn was such a, let's say, controversial figure.
Yeah.
That everybody in the Sonic Youth and all these people, they just left the label because,
I'm trying to think. Is that book, Corporate Rock Sucks? Is that the book?
Yeah, it's a great book. If you haven't read that one, it's great.
Yeah, I've seen it, but I haven't checked that one out yet. So, Jim Ruland is the author of that book.
Yes, yeah.
Nice. How long did it take you to sort of like unpack what the scope of this book was going to be?
Well, that's a good question. Initially, I knew I wanted to start with John Oswald. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to end with Girl Talk. And I knew I had to talk about Negative Land. And then the Avalanches, I ended up picking last, I think, because, like you say, there's an Avalanches book. They got a lot of press already, so I wasn't sure. But I think they tell that part of the story the best, their experience with that album. And then going backwards, I didn't think I would go back to Charles Ives in 1920. So that initial chapter, I was going to have a little prologue that says, look, this is what sampling was like before, and then we're going to fast forward to 1985. And then I just kept going and uncovering more and more stuff. And John Lydecker has a wonderful podcast series called Variations, and he really goes into depth about all this stuff. And so I was like, well, I have to at least give these people their due. Your John Cages, of course, disco and hip hop play a part. Yeah. So that was the hardest. I knew the main meat of the story was about 1985 to 2015 or so. But then the hard part was figuring out where all this starts. And you can go earlier. I mean, quoting in music goes back centuries, of course. But I think most of my troubles was figuring out how do I contain this into at least the 20th century.
I'm also very pleased, having worked myself on a book about Weird Al that will hopefully be out very soon.
Oh yeah, are you done with it?
The manuscript is done. It's been sent off, so now I just gotta wait for the next step. But
and which album is it?
It's the second one, the one that has "Eat It" on it.
So. All right, excellent. Yeah, there's probably some really interesting copyright stuff there too.
I mean, that's the thing is there are a lot of stories. Like for instance, like the wrangling that he has to do when he does the polka medleys, because every artist has to agree to a like a lesser royalty, because as you talk about, with a lot of these artists who are like, well, you used my sample for 2 seconds, I want half your track. Mm-hmm. All these artists have to agree, like, okay, we play your song for 10% of the track, you get 10% of the royalty for this song, that
right.
But what I was going to say is that, like, I've been in the world of sort of novelty music, and you touch upon like that in many ways, like the Dickie Goodman, Buchanan, I forget Buchanan's first name, but the Buchanan and Goodman's break-in records were also sort of like laying the way legally for like sampling in pop records. Can you explain a little bit about that better than me as I fumble through this?
No, yeah. I had to remind myself of some of this because there's so many names. It's Bill Buchanan and Dickie Goodman, and their song was called The Flying Saucer. And this was in 1956, which is amazing to think about. But what they did is basically they just sampled the hits of the day, and they put it in a goofy sort of story about flying saucers come and, what are you going to do? And then they kind of, I'd say they might crowbar a few samples in that maybe sort of fit that plot. And nobody
it's like what did you think of the alien? Earth Angel, something like that. That doesn't even make sense. Like, okay, whatever.
yeah. But they just try and get as many songs in there as they can like that. And nobody had ever done anything quite like that before. And so nobody knew what to make of it, right? And so there was a big court case where they thought they had an agreement with most of the publishers, but then a couple held out. And then they came out with a second song called Buchanan and Goodman Go to Trial. And then that was over the line for a lot of people. And so they said, okay, now we're really actually going to sue you. And the judge in that case actually said, no, this is fine. They're clever little boys who made a funny record, and we're going to let them go. And so that was actually great for fair use at the time. And the difference was that happened before sound recordings had copyrights, right? So they were only worried about the publishing. Sound copyrights came about in 1972. And so after that, it gets a lot more complicated, right?
That is wild that it took that long for sound copyrights.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting, too, because in a similar way, I think in 63 or 64, Mad Magazine was taken to court for they would publish things where they would write parody lyrics to the tune of in their magazine, but it wasn't, they didn't have sheet music. It was literally just like the lyrics. And I think Irving Berlin or somebody just didn't like it and was like, I'm going to sue you for,
Oh.
ripping me off. And it's like, this is like mind crime. Like how thought crime, like how how do you even know that they know how to carry a tune when they're reading the lyrics? Like, it's like, I don't know.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I guess that too would be the composition copyright that he was mad about. But yeah. Did it have the sheet music or just the words?
No, that's what I'm saying. It was literally just the words, and then it would say like to the tune of
wow.
White Christmas or something like that.
Oh,
and then I think. I mean, they won overall, but I think for some odd reason, maybe because a few words were too similar. Like one of the songs, they're like, actually, this one's not good, but the other 37 are okay. And it was kind of an odd ruling, but it basically was like parody lyrics are good, and so someone like Weird Al can continue to have a career. Like,
wow, interesting. I'm gonna have to read your book because I didn't know this stuff about parody.
You were talking about how you weren't sure about including the Avalanches, but I like that you do, because the story of the Avalanches is about doing the due diligence and trying to clear the samples, but having so many that you don't even maybe know what everything is. Whereas Girl Talk is like, we're going to fake it till we make it. Like,
Yeah, the Avalanches, that's why I was initially hesitant about including them, was because it was like, well, is it plunderphonic if you go through and license everything? No, according to my definition. But it's instructive because it demonstrates how difficult it is.
Yeah.
And even though I think one of the best characters in the book is Pat Shanahan, the detective, who is this, she's this old woman who has just been doing this for years and years and years, and she knew everybody in the music business. And she was called the detective because she would track you down or across the globe to get licenses that her clients wanted. And so it took her help, and even then, as that album, Since I Left You, was published in country after country, you see different samples get dropped. Because as they become more and more famous, more artists are going, wait a second, take mine off, or I want more money, or permission here but not there. And so you can kind of, it's a good test case for seeing the limits of that sample clearance system. And that was in 2000, and since then it's gotten even more strict, right? So, according to the official, legal definition of plunderphonics, where it's all unlicensed samples, it doesn't quite fit. But I think it's a really great example of how impossible it now is for any album like that to be made, right?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you say that part of the reason that Girl Talk probably gets away with it is just because nobody wants a legal decision that will break not in their favor. So the record companies don't want to bring it, and then it turns out, because they know that it'll probably go to trial as opposed to a settlement, and they don't want it to break in favor of well, actually, he's completely changed your song. He can do whatever he wants, and that's the decision they don't want.
Absolutely. Everybody is avoiding a fair use defense, meaning major labels are avoiding the possibility even of it being considered in an actual court of law. And so Illegal Art and Philo T. Farnsworth, which is not his real name, obviously,
right.
But they were so serious, and they were backed with good lawyers about fair use, and they're going, yeah, we'll go to court, and this is our defense. We're telling you right now that we'll do it. That people said, okay, it's not worth it, because if a fair use defense goes in favor of Girl Talk, licensing as we know it goes out the window. And I'd say that, I don't know if it's the majority, but a whole lot of the profits in the record industry today come from sample license clearancing. So they're not going to touch it. They'll send cease and desist letters, and they'll threaten, and they'll huff and puff, but there's not going to risk that money, basically.
Related, unrelated, did you read that recent book about Spotify? Mood
No,
Machine?
Oh, I didn't know this. That
Um,
sounds interesting.
utterly infuriating.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the ways that they really don't care about music as an art form and are just like, how can we create sound wallpaper and pay the musicians who make it less than is any, it's just like a very infuriating read, but also illuminating as to the current
Yeah,
state of
that's
our, yeah.
Spotify changed things so much that's why I had to stop my book in about 2014, 2015,
Hmm.
because then Spotify enters and changes the game so completely that, like you say, I mean, it takes a whole nother book to address what Spotify has done.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Even you talking about how now there are just bots that like roam YouTube to be like, oh, I recognize that sound, you're shut down. I recognize that sound, you're shut down, unless you pay, Warner Music Group, whatever, or something.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a lot harder to fight against than, I say at the end of my book, it's really bad luck to get sued by Michael Jackson. But that's a great story, and you can, get a lot of mileage and a lot of publicity and have people really listen to you if Michael Jackson sues you. But if you put up your song on Spotify or on YouTube and then somebody takes it down through a DMCA takedown notice, I don't think the New York Times is going to care, And so it's a much more sort of prevalent, but also kind of, it becomes boring because it's so mundane. It happens all the time. And so it's much harder to fight against.
Well, yeah. Even the anecdote that you have early in the book about, oh my goodness, it's the early version of the KLF. But what was the name of the group at the time?
Oh,
Um,
the justified ancients of Moo.
Right, exactly. Like that thing where basically ABBA's representatives are like, you need to destroy all remaining copies of this recording that samples Dancing Queen, and so they end up deciding to burn it, and then it leads to an altercation with the farmer whose land they decide to burn it on, and he shoots at them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the brilliant thing I think about these plunderphonic artists is that they're not only savvy in terms of the law and copyright and all of that stuff, but they know how to tell a good story and they know how to kind of manipulate these levers and get people to pay attention to them. Because, if Abba sues me, I'm going to write a letter and say, sorry, sorry, sorry. Please stop paying attention to me. And they go, we're going to go up to Sweden and we're going to talk to these people and we're going to bring a journalist and a photographer and we're going to cause chaos. And even though nobody was there, nobody was around for miles. And when they arrive, they don't talk to Abba. They're in front of some lampshade store because they got the wrong address. And it's 3 a.m., nothing actually happens. But they're able to spin it into this great story. And that gets into the enemy. And then they get press. So that's a really brilliant part of that's why it's sort of so easy to write the book, is because these people just have amazing stories to begin with.
But also even just the notion that they're like, well, this is how the corporate entity is like, we'll solve the problem by destroying the remaining copies or recalling the copy. And it's like, now in the internet, like once something's out, it's out. Like even with Plunderphonic, it's kind of like, okay, well, the like 200 people that have it and care will start making tapes. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
was the physical item anything like I guess that sort of thing, like how can you contain it? You can't contain it. I don't.
Yeah, yeah. People started copying Plunderphonic immediately. There was something called the Copyright Violation Squad, and and they would set up around. I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but the tape beetles, which I talk about later, are actually part of that in Iowa City. But yeah, there were different locations around the world, and you send them a blank tape, and then they dub Plunderphonic onto it, send it back to you for free or a nominal fee. And so this was getting out even before the internet. If people are interested, they'll find ways to find this stuff.
Later with the internet, when you were talking about how there was, what was it, Gray Tuesday or Gray Thursday, where it's just like a bunch of websites were like, all right, we're going to host the Gray album, everybody download it now, like that kind of
thing. That was a way to just kind of show the record industry that they were losing power, I think. This was a transition point, 2004, when, Napster had been sued and had kind of gone away, but you still have LimeWire and all of these other ways to get music for free. And the Recording Industry Association of America was panicking a bit. And Grey Tuesday was a group of websites that said, here is Danger Mouse's Grey album for free. Download it from us. And EMI, the Beatles record label, sent out cease and desist letters to all of them, hundreds of them. And they all said, no, we're going to keep it up, And for that one day, I think over 100,000 copies were downloaded. And it would have been the top-selling album of that day, except nobody made any money from it. And so the organizers said, they were called Downhill Battle was the organization. They said, well, look, what are you doing? You could be making so much money, but the Beatles aren't making money. Jay-Z's not making money. You're not making money because you're trying to stomp this thing out instead of support it and offer some legal way to buy it.
Do you think the mashup went away just because it, or is less prevalent? I guess it still exists in some form. Just because of the fashions of music, or is it because of the difficulty of clearing samples and like the crackdown of the big companies?
Well, I've never really thought about why mashups went away. I mean, they're sort of a novelty. And novelties usually don't have a long shelf life. So unless it's really clever and really well done, because I talk about a few good mashups in my book, but we have to remember there were a lot of bad mashups. Because the great thing, but also the downside of a mashup is anybody can download GarageBand and make it on your own laptop, and then put it on Napster or LimeWire, and then it's out in the world. So I think part of it is just the novelty kind of wears off after you hear it.
Actually, that's a great point, because I'm remembering now all the people that would be like, okay, I'm taking Jay-Z's Black Album and I'm combining it with Weezer's Blue Album for the Black and Blue Album,
right.
I'm combining it with Metallica for the Ultra Black Album.
Yeah. There's a few great albums that came out of that, but then another thing is just like after Girl Talk, what do you do? Sure. I mean, you're not going to come around and outdo Girl Talk.
Right.
So I think people got kind of scared of, what, am I going to top him? So.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
One thing we need to talk about, I think, is the role of hip-hop in all of this. Because the book's about Plunderphonics, which is specifically, these people putting unlicensed samples in their music to make a point. But this stuff really originated with hip-hop, and all of the sort of early cases where this became a legal issue were in hip-hop, right? So the Beastie Boys got sued. De La Soul got sued. Of course, there's the Biz Markie example. Hip-hop is important because it's the moment at which this sort of sampling goes really, really mainstream, right? John Oswald and Negativland got a lot of press, but throughout the 90s, sampling in terms of Plunderphonics goes underground.
Mm-hmm.
So they're able to kind of get away with stuff just because they're not selling that many records, It's not worth writing up the cease and desist because, you're wasting your lawyer's time. You're not going to make the money back from the hour that you paid him to write the letter. Hip-hop is sort of the reverse, because after Biz Markie, hip-hop is so popular that they're not going to get away with it. So they really do have to pay for these samples all of a sudden. And then you see this complete drop-off in sampling in hip-hop, where suddenly instead of, the Bomb Squad putting dozens of samples in a Public Enemy album, you get one, maybe two samples per track. And it becomes almost like a way of bragging, like, yeah, I was able to afford this Led Zeppelin track or whatever, you know? And then it changes the music also, because if you just have one sample that repeats throughout the song, you know, it's going to sound much different. So I kind of focus on half of the picture, right? When Plunderphonics goes underground, they have strategies of avoiding these types of lawsuits. But in hip hop, they didn't have a choice, because hip hop was, you know, the most popular form of music in the United States at the time. So they just had to pay. So that's sort of another half of the picture that I don't get to talk about a lot in my book. But there's a bit in there about Beastie Boys, De La Soul, the people in the late 80s that did face these issues for the first time.
And the like Negative Land side during this period, because like you talk about how they pointedly make an album like making fun of Pepsi, and Pepsi's response is like, it wasn't,
Right, yeah. Yeah, Negative Land should get a lot of credit for sort of opening up that space that I'm talking about for underground plunderphonic artists to sample without getting hassled, let's say.
Yeah.
Because they were so, I don't know how to call it, courageous and forceful with their defense of, you know, their fair use principles with U2. And they had lawyers, and they had very good lawyers who were working with them for free from Stanford, you know. And so people said, let's not touch Negative Land. And then by extension, let's not touch anybody who's even on that side of the ideological spectrum. Anybody who is an independent artist, A, we're not going to get the money back because they don't have the money to pay us even if we win. But B, they're going to make this argument for fair use, right? So, yeah, I think the Pepsi thing is really interesting because they were sort of, I mean, they were clearly sort of taunting Pepsi and saying, you know, I don't want to say they wanted to get sued, but it sort of sounded like that.
Right.
And the reason that the Pepsi spokespeople just sort of shrugged it off was because they knew that Negative Land had the lawyers, and they also saw the album. They, you know, Dyspepsy is the name of the album, and its booklet was basically a treatise on fair use and copyright. And here's all the reading that you, the listener, should do if you really want to understand our stance. Well, that booklet was really for Pepsi's lawyers, right? It wasn't for the curious listener. It was to say, we know that you're maybe going to sue us, but here's what we're going to do in response. And they were prepared. They had a letter all written up by their lawyers. You know, if Pepsi goes after us, this is how we immediately respond. We have it written out already. And I think that's why Pepsi sort of said, you know, it's an okay album. Let's talk about something else now.
Yeah, it is interesting too, because I feel like some of the reactions that like copyright holders have, like, you know, like Mark Volman with De La Soul, or whoever the flute artist was with the Beastie Boys that you talk about, like they seem to be coming at it less of like, well, I mean, a little bit of like wanting the money, but sort of being like, you stole from me. And meanwhile, there are artists that are blatantly like, we're stealing from you. And they you know, they're garnering this different kind of attention. It's like, maybe you don't have the money to pay us.
Yeah, it's interesting when it's not a major label, but an individual artist who genuinely, James Newton is the name of this flautist who ended up on a Beastie Boys record and didn't know anything about it for years. And he was teaching at some university, and a student came up to him and said, "Oh, you worked with the Beastie Boys." And he said, "What?" And then eventually he found out through a student that, you know, this composition of his was on a Beastie Boys album. The sound recording was legitimately licensed through ECM, his recording company. But he didn't know anything about it because they didn't have a current address when all this happened in the 90s. He just wanted control over his music, and you kind of get the sense that, you know, the Turtles or Gilbert O'Sullivan, they're kind of from an older generation who you kind of get the sense that, maybe they want a paycheck, but they also want control over their output.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, you feel for them because they've lost control of something that they've basically dedicated their lives to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, the other side of that is that Adam Yauch of the Beastie Boys said that James Newton really wanted a lot of money. So it depends on who you're listening to, too.
I get it, but also, like, I don't know, like, you were in the counterculture. You were like, I mean, I don't know about James Newton, but it's like you're an artist. It seems so antithetical to me to be like, yes, it's sort of like what you're talking about with like Charles Ives is like maybe too many people think that they're the genius, and it's like no. I created this fundamental thing, and you must pay respect to me, but instead there's maybe a greater flow of music in the universe, or I don't know.
Right? Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, the Beastie Boys included, say no to sample requests that they simply don't agree with. So there's a sort of middle ground where it's not that certain artists disagree with anybody using their music completely. James Brown, for example, he would say no to any request that would end up in a song that, in his opinion, valorized drugs or, lifestyle choices that he might not approve of or whatever. In the Beastie Boys case, it's like if they just don't dig your tune, they might not let you sample, which is funny. But I think that part of it is just having control over what you've made and its impact in the world, right? But it's getting increasingly difficult to keep that. It's kind of like keeping water in your cupped hands. People are going to use your music, and it's going to get out there in all kinds of different forms and manifestations. And at a certain point, for people like James Newton, it was way too late. He didn't find out it happened until 10 years later.
It's outside the scope of your book, but like, how do you feel like AI enters into it? Because, like, for instance, I follow this account on Instagram called There, I Ruined It, that takes like different pieces of songs and meshes them together in a funny way. But also he started doing AI things where like now he's made Johnny Cash sing Snoop Dogg lyrics or something like that. And it's clearly like for comic effect. And he's like saying, this is an AI manipulation or whatever. But like, how do you feel like AI enters into this conversation?
Yeah, if you want to know more about AI and fair use, my full interview with Negative Land is going to be published tomorrow. So by the time this goes out, it'll be on the internet, just on Tone Glow. So Google Tone Glow Negative Land. And it'll come up. And John Lydecker, who's a member of Negative Land, really has thought a lot about this problem. Because what has happened is basically OpenAI and these, giant multi-billionaire corporations have taken the fair use argument and twisted it around, right? And said like, well, yeah, you're creatively appropriating other people's music and we're creatively appropriating other people's images or text or whatever. So you can see how the same logic kind of persists, but the context is so much different, right? Because, like I say, OpenAI is a billion, however many billions they have. And Negative Land was an indie band and, on SST Records. So who has the power in either case is completely reversed.
Yeah.
And I'm not as up to date on the AI stuff as the Negative Land people are. So if you really want to know a lot about that, read the full interview, because this is now a problem that they're getting questions about, right? They go on tour, and they said that they went a few years ago with their documentary that was made about them. And there was a Q&A section, and the questions were like, well, what about AI? What do you do with fair use in this new context, right? And they had to really sit down and discuss as a band, well, how do we address this? What are they doing to our argument? No, they're clearly evil, meaning, OpenAI and all that stuff. But, John Leidecker says something very smart, which is that in a way, the pictures that you make and the songs that you make are really a distraction from the real issue with AI, which is that it uses so much water, it uses so much electricity, in order to make like glorified Microsoft Paint. And this is what we're using all of our resources for. So I stopped my book in 2015 when Girl Talk kind of comes to an end, so I don't get into AI there, and like Spotify, I just can't cover it all. I mean, it's such a massive issue and it's still ongoing. There's still lawsuits pending about the use of people's books and images and all kinds of things in those machines.
Yeah, it's maybe a little confusing, but it does certainly seem like what is what is easy to parse is like, well, who's benefiting? Is it the person with a lot of money or the person with no money?
Right. That's exactly it. Is like trying to wind your way through all the intricacies of copyright law and stuff is interesting, but all you have to do is take a step back and go like, wait a second. This is a massive, massive corporation, and they're not taking a little bit of U2 and making a funny song out of it. They're hoovering up all of the intellectual property in the world and saying, now we control all of it. And if you want to utilize our little platform, sure, but pay us money, And so if you think about it that way, it's obviously not the same at all.
Yeah, certainly not. Well, on that cheery note, did you have any parting thoughts?
Well, parting thoughts, I don't know. Read the book.
Yes, Plunderphonics in the Genre 33 1/3 series by Matthew Blackwell. We will have it. We have several copies already stocked in our Arts Annex at SKYLIT Books, but of course, go to your local bookshop and get it there.
Absolutely.
Do you know, is it available in the Canary Islands or?
That's a good question. I haven't seen it yet. Most of the bookstores here are in Spanish. So, I could order it and see how long it takes to get here. But another thing I wanted to mention is, go through this book. And one of the funnest things for me writing the book was not only listening to the Avalanches and John Oswald and all of these people, but go a level further and listen to all the sampled artists, all the funk bands from the 70s and all these weird educational records and stuff that end up in these records. That's, to me, the funnest way to read the book is to just go chapter by chapter and like, wait, what is this weird album from the, a band I've never heard of from the 60s, and then they end up in this massive, the Avalanches album from 2000 or whatever. So, go into those rabbit holes. It's a great source for just getting lost in this, giant history of music.
I love that. That's a great suggestion. Thank you again so much for being with us, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.